Right at the start of the EU referendum campaign, on the first episode of BBC Question Time, back on the 25th of February, the Reverend Giles Fraser said this:
"Even if we're poorer, I think democracy is not for sale."
When I watched that, a little alarm bell started to go off somewhere in the back of my mind. The implication of what he said was not in fact that we would be poorer, but from that point on, the suggestion that we would be poorer outside the EU seemed to be assumed in the debate, and that for those who support the Leave campaign and want independent democracy restored to the UK, there would be a price to pay. The implication being that actually democracy is for sale and has a price attached. But is that idea correct? Why would it be correct? Surely, economically, we'd be much better off as an independent, free trading nation, able to create the economic environment that suits us best for our nation, rather than having our trading arrangements and economic circumstances dictated, defined and regulated by the EU, supposedly for the wider benefit of 28 nations, with the consideration for Britain's economy being at best only a very small fraction of that consideration. A couple of weeks ago, a group of eminent and highly respected economists, people who spent their days analysing economic scenarios and getting properly researched answers to questions such as this, launched something called Economists for Brexit. Their report, which contains some quite detailed figures, in fact, illustrates an extremely prosperous future for a post-Brexit Britain. In fact, they predict that we, the consumers, will be about 8% better off after we leave the EU. On an average UK wage, that would be around £40 a week, or a huge £2,080 per year average difference. These economists have built their predictions based on the UK having no trade deal with the EU or with any other country, which is apparently the nightmare scenario according to David Cameron. I wanted to get to the bottom of this and establish exactly how they'd come to this conclusion. So last week I went to Wales to see one of their leading economists, Professor Patrick Minford. Patrick started by explaining the direction that the EU has gone in with its economic policies, since it abandoned the basis upon which it induced Britain to join the single market.
The idea was Europe would move towards free trade and away from high tariffs against the rest of the world and high trade barriers, move towards free trade, competition. It just didn't happen. Instead, what Europe has done, the EU has done, is to go in the opposite direction, towards more and more intervention. Protection is still high against the rest of the world. Regulation is extremely intrusive in lots of areas.
So, to explain that, currently the EU is a customs union that permits free trade within its borders and with all other non-EU European countries. But there's a trade barrier wall around the European Union, a system of tariffs and other trade barriers, otherwise known as protectionist measures, that isolate the EU and prevent other countries selling their products to us at lower world market prices, and which keeps prices within the European Union artificially high because European producers are not having to sell to their EU customers at the same prices as they would have to if they had to compete with the true prices of producers from the rest of the world.
So a trade barrier works to raise the price to the consumer in the area and thus limit the demand from that person, because obviously they're paying a higher price, they buy less of it.
Okay.
And so a tariff is a direct thing that is permanently put on the price of what you buy from abroad.
But how do tariffs work? This is a very useful graph, a link to which you should find below, which shows the amount of tariffs we pay. The highest tariffs are on things such as wine near the top at 32%, followed by food and farmed products, and then manufactured goods, clothing and textiles, then heavy industrial products, the largest of which is vehicles. So who does this tariff regime suit? Well, primarily it helps France and Germany. France has a huge agricultural industry, with more than 2.5 times the land that the UK does. With almost the same population, it has much more space for farming. France benefits from huge tariffs on agricultural products brought from outside the EU, and in addition gets a huge subsidy, paid in significant part by the UK.
French farming, the whole CAP, of course, is there to benefit the French.
Yeah.
And they won't allow it to be altered, you see. The French are the absolute, defend to the death the common agricultural policy.
Similarly, Germany benefits hugely from tariffs as well. Just look at the two types of goods we purchase the most from the EU. Heavy engineered products, the things exported primarily by Germany. And Italy also benefits to a lesser extent from its textiles industry. So what does the UK get from this arrangement? Well, look at the thing we export in the largest quantity, and you'll see that the tariff is zero. So we get absolutely no advantage, no protection there from this system. And who's the EU's largest export market? The UK. So by being in the EU, we're prevented from buying from the rest of the world at world market prices, and artificially induced to pay inflated prices for buying French, German and Italian products. But tariffs are only part of the picture. If I tell you how I think it works, tell me where I'm going wrong. Essentially in Brussels you have somewhere between 15 and 25,000 lobbyists working in some instances for social concerns, for Greenpeace and for lobbying for social reform. But you also have a vast proportion of those lobbyists who are working on behalf of large multinational businesses.
Exactly.
And effectively what they are lobbying for is a regulatory regime which cuts other, usually smaller businesses, out of the market.
Yes, this is what I think is happening. There's the trade barriers around the European space,
Yep.
and then there's a regulative structure on the European space.
Okay.
And the regulative structure favours big businesses. It favours intervention, which big businesses can handle because they've got big HR departments.
Yep.
They lobby, as you rightly say. So they've got big lobbying departments. And they basically create a space in which big business thrives with less entry potential from competition, certainly from outside. And the way the prices are raised by protection inside the space, and the whole thing is policed really by the fact that the prices are kept high, and the regulations are favouring the big corporate entities.
Interests, yeah. So it's not just the tariffs that make things expensive.
When you go through the falls in prices, I mean, for example, for cars, it's not just the tariff. You see, it's all these barriers.
Yeah.
That are kind of, you can't really sort of, now you see them, now you don't, but you see it in the price.
Yeah.
So the kind of takeaway point is that you pay the same in dollars for a car in the US as you pay in pounds here.
Yes.
It's kind of like probably about 25%.
So when we leave the EU, we'll see a big reduction in prices. But how long will it take for that change to occur?
It would take some time for the structure of the economy to change and adjust, yes. You'd get the benefits to the consumers on day one because the prices would go to world prices on day one.
Just waiting for the containers to arrive, basically, aren't you?
Yes, you're waiting for the containers to arrive, exactly.
So all that sounds fantastic. An almost immediate saving for everyone of £40 a week on an average wage, and then many more savings as we gradually get rid of those regulations and more producers can sell to us at even lower prices. But what about our exports? Wouldn't our exports be harmed? Because we might be selling to the EU with their trade barriers in place. Well, only about 5% of UK companies export to Europe, so the remaining 95% would be released from the costs of needing to comply with EU regulations. And there are two other things to consider.
Well, the first thing you've got to realise is that none of this applies to services.
No, sure, okay.
So there's no
okay.
common tariff on services.
And the second is that our exports to the EU are in fact around 40% services, not physical goods. And so services do face trade barriers wherever they're being traded in the world, including in the EU right now. So that wouldn't be any different. And the remaining small proportion of our overall economy that are physical goods exported to the EU, as we saw from the graph earlier, are often not the high tariff items anyway. The high tariff items are mostly the items that the Germans and French produce in volume. Which is why, overall, Patrick's detailed model for what happens when we're outside the EU shows that overall we'd be so much better off, even without any trade deals with the EU. But what about the future for manufacturing in Britain? Well, the UK is an advanced economy. As award-winning filmmaker Danny Boyle showed us at that spectacular opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in 2012, the days when our country was filled with factories churning out consumer goods are way behind us. Unless we want to turn back the clock 100 or 200 years and reduce the minimum wage to pennies so we can compete with Chinese manufacturing costs, we need to do more of the things that we do so well and which Danny Boyle showed the world that we do in such glorious detail. Our creative and financial services, our high-tech manufacturing, IT, pharmaceuticals, aerospace, and our science and technology. The future for a prosperous Britain is in doing the things we do well and freely trading them with others for the things we need. Our exports to the rest of the world are booming right now, whilst the EU is declining. And with lower costs of imports, we can keep growing whilst making ourselves more prosperous. I'll leave the last words on the subject of what so many of the politicians have been saying about this issue to us the people, to Patrick.
Politicians say to them, oh, single market, wonderful thing, you know, we're in this market of 500 million consumers. What they don't tell them is it costing them between 8 and 16% on their shopping basket, and that's a big cost. Nobody tells the consumer, taxpayer, this cost, because they're assumed to be stupid. Politicians don't tell them the truth. They don't tell them, you're paying for this, and this is an outrageous con on the British people.
Let's leave it for another time to further explore why the politicians, some big businesses and some international organisations are misleading the British people. Please do share this video as widely as possible. It's very important that as many people as possible really do understand exactly what's going on here and can appreciate how much better off they would be outside the European Union. Thanks for watching.